Welcome to the Off the Page podcast from Franciscan Media, a podcast that will feature in-depth conversations with Franciscan authors and artists. My name is Stephen Copeland, and I am Franciscan Media's book editor. And our next guest on the podcast is a special one, someone who probably needs no introduction, though I'm going to give you one anyway. I'm so thrilled to welcome Sister Ilia Delio to Franciscan Media's Off the Page podcast. Ilia Delio, OSF, PhD, is a Franciscan sister and an American theologian specializing in the area of science and religion. Her work often bridges evolution, physics, and neuroscience with Franciscan theology. She currently holds the Josephine C. Connolly Endowed Chair in Theology at Villanova University and also holds 2 honorary doctorates, one from St. Francis University in 2015 and one from Sacred Heart University in 2020. The focus of this conversation are the themes revolving around 2 books that were recently republished by Franciscan Media: Humility of God, A Franciscan Perspective, which was released on June 4th, 2024, and Franciscan Prayer, Awakening to Oneness with God, which was re-released on July 2nd, 2024. Though she wrote these books 20 years ago, I think you'll find that they are even more relevant today and are absolutely foundational to the work she continues to do around Franciscan theology. I personally think this is a really important conversation. In our world, God is so often used, and I think used is the right word there, is almost an extension of the ego to judge someone else or be right or, at its worst, justify the pursuit of power. So Franciscan theology has a lot to say about this because of its anchoring in the radical humility of God, which reconnects us back to our own heart and the experience and story of the other. So you'll find in this interview that Sister Ilia invites us into this profound mystery and to also be changed by it on an experiential and personal level. So it's one of the reasons why she aptly says in our interview that Franciscan theology, or at least a number of its themes, contribute to a theology of the future. I'm so thrilled to share this interview with you, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So, without further ado, here is Sister Ilia Delio. All right, so I'd like to start out with Humility of God, Sister Ilia. Why is the book's message, you wrote this book 20 years ago, why is this book's message still important today?
Yeah, I think it may be more important today than it was even 20 years ago, because we continue to have sort of a God problem insofar as we can't find God in the world. And I think our um, anxious searching for God has resulted in all sorts of conflicts, personal, collective conflicts. And I think we have over overemphasize God as a power that we need to adhere to, when we miss the fact that that power is already here. It's a power of love, as Francis himself recognized. So I go back to, as I do in the book, to the simplicity of Francis of Assisi, because I really think sometimes being educated is not an advantage. We place a lot of emphasis on education and training the mind, and we have basically done so to the detriment of the heart. And I think we are sort of heart deprived or heart starved. We have no idea even really what the heart means. And I think that Francis, this very simple person, was not kind of weighed down by over intellectualism, and therefore could really live in the concrete simplicity of life where he met God. But he was a very wise person, and so he recognized that presence of God within him as well as without. And that's where I think Bonaventure, in fact, I was just thinking about this recently, because Thomas Aquinas became the official theologian, excuse me, of the Catholic Church, but Bonaventure was a contemporary of Aquinas. And I often wonder, why Bonaventure was he drifted out of the scene. Basically, the church acknowledges him, has a nice special feast day on July 15th, but other than that, his theology does not make any significant difference. And I think, the thing is, Bonaventure developed his theology not on scholasticism alone, but on Francis of Assisi. And I think that concrete example of Francis, especially after Bonaventure was elected Minister General, played a significant role in how he thought about God and God's relationship to the world and what this means in terms of Jesus Christ. So I think we have elements in this theological tradition that have yet to be fully mined, and that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned something I wanted to come back to, how we may be heart deprived today. What does the heart mean from a Saint Francis of Assisi perspective? And perhaps he wouldn't have used the philosophical language that Bonaventure used, but I sense that the Franciscan vision has something to offer us here.
Yes. Well, and the heart did play a significant role even in Francis's own writings. And he kind of gives us a glimpse in those writings how he thinks about the heart. He tells us it is the dwelling place of the Spirit.
Mm.
And so that's actually right out of Scripture. Paul says, "You are the temple of the Holy Spirit." And so Francis recognizes, like we are the place where God dwells, and that place is the heart. Certainly, he doesn't mean the physical pumping heart, but we need that to keep going for the heart. The heart is that deep seat of the interior place of the soul, the place of the silence, the withinness that we all experience. It's deeply part of us, but it's not subject to in other words, it's more than just the thinking portion of us. Now, from a physiological perspective, the heart really is the higher level of integration. In other words, where we are taking what we know and what we feel and how we relate to things, and we integrate all that information in a higher center. And I think Francis had that notion of a deep integration of how he felt, what he experienced, and his faith in God. And that for him is the place of the heart, which can get kind of messed up by everything we weigh the heart with. Our thoughts, our preoccupations, our anxieties, our fears, like Jesus said, we kind of store these things up in our, the heart is like the barn where we store everything. And we store things up and we have no place for the Spirit to dwell. So the heart, and I take that heart as soul. I don't think those things are too far apart, those two words. It's that deep, deep center of personhood that's opened up to the mystery of God. And that was preeminent for Francis and Bonaventure.
Yeah, and that's a humble God, correct? A God that dwells within our heart, a spirit. Francis talks about creating a space within ourselves for God to dwell. That gets back to your book, correct? Like this is a humble trajectory by
Yes,
the divine.
that's right, Stephen. In other words, God is not. So Thomas Aquinas, had this notion that God has kind of an inner self and an outer self. And Thomas's God is like happy to be within God's own life as being, perfect being, and freely decides to create. But the Franciscan God begins not with being, but with goodness. So a self-diffusiveness of God, a God who is, in a sense, unstoppable in that highest good or love. And that means that God will go to the ends of the earth, will go to the lowest place, whatever is left out of that goodness, God will go there to be there, God for us. And that's the type of God that Bonaventure conveys to us, a God who bends low in love, and embraces us, lifts us up, because God, not only is God good, but God desires to share that good. And so the will of God is that love be shared and reciprocated. As Francis said, the love of him who loved us is greatly to be loved. So I think those two. Yeah. are in tandem with each other. That was my little cat too. So
Oh.
even loved. So she's very insistent. And that would be Francis, right? So, the intellectual says, I'm doing something very important here. I'm having this very important conversation, and I don't care about the cat.
Mm,
The door. The Franciscan says, no, the cat is at the door and wants to come in because the cat wants to be loved. So that's so that act of love is higher than the act of knowledge alone. I think that's the
mm.
position.
Only you could connect theology back to your cat wanting into the room.
True. True.
Yeah, it's you mentioned a lot there. You mentioned this deep center and a God for Francis and Bonaventure that humbly bends low into our lives and dwells within us. How did this vision differ from other Christian theology of that day? Were they hitting on something that was maybe perhaps not new, but had been forgotten?
Yeah, I think, I see kind of now let me just, trace this back to what Bonaventure, what inspires Bonaventure is not so much the philosophical tradition per se, because he does rely on Aristotle and Plato, just in the same way that Thomas Aquinas did. But it's the role of scripture, I think, plays a significant role. And this, of course, is very, consonant with Francis's evangelical life or gospel-based life. And in scripture, and Bonaventure tells us in the Itinerarium, or his soul's journey into God, yes, God is being, God is perfect being, eternal being, but he says that's the name of God in the Old Testament, the name of God that's revealed to Moses. I am who I am. But he says God reveals God's self in a new way in the New Testament. When Jesus is asked the question, um, um, are you, how is the question in Luke? I forget how the question says, but Jesus says, no one is good but God alone. And
Mm,
Bonaventure takes that that kind of response of Jesus, no one is good but God alone, as the new name of God. So that's what he's saying. Yes, God is being, but God is a type of being. So it's not just what that God is being, but God is a certain type of being, a being that is diffusive goodness. And therefore, I think good is even higher than being for Bonaventure. And I think that goes right back to the Pseudo Dionysius, that, if you go up, if you try to really approach God into this, you go up, 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 up for the Dionysius, and you go into the realm of silence, and you can't say, because being is diffusive. It's, God is more than what we can, but it's not an unknowing. And I think that's the difference between Thomas and Bonaventure. God is not unknowable. God is overwhelming. That's God is overwhelming goodness. And that's what Francis experiences in creation, the overwhelming good. So Francis experiences that and discusses it in using superlatives. You are most high, all good, supreme good, totally good, not just like you're good, as Thomas, Aquinas would, or the Thomists would say, God is good. No, God is most good. And that's a huge difference, actually, between Franciscan theology and Thomistic theology.
mm.
Not the unknowable God, the overwhelmingness of God.
Yeah, and if that overwhelming is, if being is self-diffusive, like you mentioned, as Bonaventure says, now that invites us into a God who is not only being, like object being, but who is becoming. Correct? Am I reading that, interpreting that correctly, or?
We could. So Bonaventure was a medievalist, right? So he always wrote within the boundaries of his own age. And, he will say, as he does, that God is immutable. But there's, you can see there's a tension in his writings, quite honestly, if you look closely. So he's like, well, I really can't go outside these boundaries. They're not going to let me teach anymore. So he stays, within the language of scholasticism. But he says for us, for example, in the Itinerarium, goodness is both necessary and free. So, in other words, there's a necessity in God. In Bonaventure, it's a dialectic. God freely creates, but God is the highest good, and God, in a sense, has to share that goodness. A goodness can't contain, it can't stay within itself. Like Thomas's God is like, yeah, I can, I can be perfectly at home. I don't need you guys, I don't need creation. Like, yeah, I just think it's a nice idea. I think I'll make creation and have a good time there. But Bonaventure is like, this is unstoppable goodness. This is like, so in that sense, that place of necessity of the good to diffuse itself, not just free, but it has to, love has to, in a sense, go out of itself. That's what love does. Love that stays inward looking, right, is selfish love. And God is not selfish. God is completely communicative. Of course, we wouldn't even be able to say the name of God if God wasn't communicative. All of this to say, this does lend itself away from kind of this God-world relationship, which is engineered as a providential relationship, to a process type of relationship. God is deeply related to the world, and the world is deeply related to God. And, again, I think there would have to be a much stronger case than I'm going to tell you here, but, Bonaventure sees that God is completely revealed in Jesus Christ, right? So it's very Christocentric. And this is where I see a resonance between Bonaventure and Teilhard de Chardin. And Teilhard would say, God becomes something new in Christ. And I think you can read that into Bonaventure as well. Like God is even more God precisely in and with the human person than apart from the human person or creation. And so there's
Yeah.
a way to read process theology back into Bonaventure's humility of God. It's another
Yeah.
powerful thing to be done.
Yeah. His sounds like a perfect problem for you to address.
Of course, never getting bored, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering, that leads to my next question. Like you wrote Humility of God 20 years ago. But I was wondering how the themes from this book apply today to your work in science or perhaps your scholarship on Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah,
Are there certain themes here that are still playing out in your work?
absolutely. In fact, my work actually can be traced back to Bonaventure's humility of God, quite honestly. It's a God who doesn't stay within God's self, but goes out of God's self. And of course, the culmination of that divine love is, in a sense, shown in the Christ. And that kind of theology, first of all, John Templeton, the Templeton Foundation, spoke about the need for the humility of God. So, there's a way that science, John Templeton himself saw the humility of God as the route science would benefit by, in the kind of the move towards renewing a dialogue between science and religion. Teilhard de Chardin, really, he never used the term humility of God because he didn't know Bonaventure, but it's there, it's implicit in his work. It's a God who bends low and is deeply involved and cares for. This is a God of care and compassion, and a God who's entwined. You can't be compassionate and be apathetic at the same time. You can't be compassionate at a distance. To be compassionate is to be engaged in the suffering of another. And I think that's the kind of God Bonaventure holds out for us, Teilhard builds on. So a lot of Bonaventure's theology is kind of brought into my own thinking and then trying to be updated now in light of what science is telling us, and and where we're going, even with artificial intelligence. But I think the key of what is similar both in the Humility of God book and in Teilhard is the Christocentrism, or not in a narrow sense, like we all have to be Christian or Catholic, but in the widest sense that God, divine love, is incarnate throughout all of creation and is recapitulated in the human person.
Mm.
And therefore it gives a form to the universe, as Teilhard would say. We are created for something. There's something taking place in creation. And in the Pauline sense, it's the body of Christ, or the pleroma, the fullness of Christ. So there's a deep resonance, all this to say, between Bonaventure and Teilhard. And were I to write the book all over again, I would probably include pretty much all the same themes and maybe tack on another 5 chapters.
5 chapters about Teilhard.
Probably.
Yeah, you mentioned something there, Sister Ilia. I was wondering how the Franciscan interpretation, the Franciscan experiential approach to the Incarnation, how that really helps to captures the wrong word, but it invites us into to contemplate the radical humility of a God that bends low.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And, there is a significant difference, again, I think, between Franciscan theology and Thomistic theology. Thomas, of course, acknowledged the role of original sin and fallenness of creation. And following St. Anselm, if, Adam had not sinned, Christ would not come. So, yea to sin, because we got a good out of it. We got the Christ. Bonaventure holds sort of a via media, a place in between, because he's a scholastic, and he does, in his Breviloquium, in his Sentus Commentary, he acknowledges original sin. But then you go back to how he's conceiving God, the Trinity, the triune God, in relation to creation. And as Zachary Hayes pointed out a number of years ago, it's really not sin, but the excess love and mercy of God for Bonaventure. That's the reason for the Incarnation. And so, again, it's not explicit, like he's not in your face, like this is it, folks. But Duns Scotus comes along and says, yeah, let me tell you another way to look at this thing. So, and Scotus is really like, well, God is love, and that's kind of interesting. He's coming at it from a different, a little bit slightly different philosophical position, but very complementary to Bonaventure. God is love. And love is never going to do anything for a defect, like, oh my gosh, there's this big hole in creation I've got to repair, So it's like, why would the highest love, just be shown to us out of a defect in creation? Or, as Brother Bill Short always says, why build the Taj Mahal to cover a pothole? Why do something so incredible for this? So the Scotistic notion of the primacy of Christ, that whether or not sin ever existed, Christ would have come, is really based on the absolute love of God, or Bonaventurean says the absolute self-diffusion of God's goodness, right? And so the universe is made for something from the beginning, and it's made for love, quite honestly. And Teilhard picks that up right away. Teilhard actually discovered Duns Scotus rather late in life from a Franciscan, Father Allegra, I think a conventual Franciscan, Sicilian at that. And he said, that's it. That's the theology of the future. But the difference is Scotus saw Christ as the blueprint of creation. That's what we're made for. And Teilhard saw Christ as the goal of creation. They're complementary, but just because Teilhard's thinking in terms of evolution. So all of this to say that the Franciscan reason for the Incarnation is distinctly different from Thomas Aquinas. And again, it's not being based on fallenness or being or original sin. It's simply based on love.
Yeah.
It's original love, as Matthew Fox might have said, original blessing. And what would our world look like if we actually had a church based on original love? Like that's what we're for. And I think, honestly, because we're very Thomistic, we're a very self-focused group on sin and fallenness, and everything is due to the weakness of human nature and fallen human nature. And I'm like, wow, how do we ever get this far if we're so depraved, and we need God to save us? And I'm like, oh gosh. And I think God just simply wants to be loved. And like we would do well to love God in return because we're more together in God than without God. So it's as simple as that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we keep coming back to Bonaventure, and I know Bonaventure's a huge part of this book. He's probably on every page. Weird question. If you could ask Saint Bonaventure anything today, what would it be? What do you think you would ask him?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know because I would have said, how would you have finished your final collations on the 6 days of creation? Because his thought, in my view, really culminated in the set of lectures, and he died. There's nothing worse dying in the middle of a book, so to speak. So he set out something, and here's what's so fascinating: in that first collation on the 6 days of creation, his thought really matured to the fact that Christ is metaphysics. He put Christ at the center of metaphysics or being. And that's just like, no one has really figured that one out at all. Like, what does that mean? And, basically he's saying that love is the basis and the root reality, I think, of all that exists, and that it is personal and singular. And so, anyway, his metaphysics of being and his way of knowledge, epistemology, are the same. To put this, a lot of big words here. All this to say is love goes further than knowledge. Again, in the West, we're too focused. Think of artificial intelligence. We're so fearful we're going to download our brains, lose our brains, computers are going to take over our brains. And I'm like, yeah, that could be. In fact, that may not be the worst thing in my view. But computers will not take over the capacity to love beyond measure. In other words, love, the will is higher than the mind for Bonaventure, I think. And that's what I think that metaphysics of Christ, the center, is pointing in that direction. That love goes further than knowledge, that wisdom is a higher knowledge, as Augustine tells us. And we simply never got that into our bloodstream, certainly in the West. I think actually, and I say the West because I think Eastern religions have their own version of love that's actually more attuned to modern science and a healthier view of humans and ecology on the whole. But the West, we're just fixated on knowledge and perfection of knowledge and the mind, and how many degrees you have and where you went to school and how many things you've studied, how many books you've written, and who cares? Because really what moves us is like Mother Teresa feeding the poor, or Dorothy Stang, defending the people of the Amazon. We are much more moved by people who love than by people who know.
Yeah, which goes back to the heart where we started.
Back to the heart. And so I'd like to know how Bonaventure would have finished those lectures. Because
Yeah.
developing it into a whole history, like Joachim of Fiore's idea of this is what history is about. It's the unfolding of God, the whole Trinity thing.
Yeah. Yeah, but before I switch gears and move on to the other book that you wrote 20 years ago, Franciscan Prayer, do you have any other comments on the humility of God, or anything we may have left
Well,
out, or anything you wanted to hit on?
no, it's just that honestly, I don't hear it talked about. I don't hear it preached. I go to a Franciscan parish. I'd like to have Franciscans start preaching on their own theology instead of borrowing Thomas Aquinas all the time, or just some random contemporary writer. I'm saying that we have elements in this tradition that need to be brought out because people are desperately looking for the very things we already have. We have the treasure within, right? And we're not mining this treasure. And we need more scholars, quite honestly. We don't have enough Franciscan scholars or people who can tap into this tradition and really bring it out, like the Jesuits have done for Thomas Aquinas. That I have to give it to them. They really have mined Thomas for the modern age, but we haven't done so. And for some reason we keep this tradition very medieval, and it doesn't have to be locked into its medieval constraints. It's a medieval tradition that has a lot of modern implications. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to do now, but we need other people on board here. And we need to start understanding what the humility of God means for us today in a world of AI, in a world of science, in a world of cultural and societal polarities and oppositions. What does that a humility, a humble God mean when you have political differences, when you have interracial marriages, when you have transgender and non-binary gender, and whatever persons are? How do we love in the midst of differences? Because love is our binding force, and differences are overcome by love, quite honestly.
Yeah. Could you answer your own question there? Like, what does the humility of God have to say to us today? As you mentioned these different, yeah,
Really simple. Stop judging. Stop having your big, ideas of what people should be, and really meet the concrete person in a concrete way. Like, look at them eye to eye, maybe touch them once in a while, even if you're going to do it virtually. Make sure you're looking them in the eye. See how they smile, see what their face is like. All of this is where God is being radiated as the humility of God. And so, we tend to be, our minds are elsewhere. They're roaming around the earth, thinking about our meetings and what we have to do. And we're so disembodied. And the humility of God is about embodiment. Maybe that's a very concise way to say it. A God who takes on a body, the love of
mm,
God in an embodied way. That's all we're saying.
I
And
love
all
that.
find your body again.
Yeah. Yeah, which is so that really goes back to Saint Francis, right? Who's so concrete and experiential, and every being he encounters, he's reading it in a way where it's speaking something to him about this God who loves him.
Right. It's all about embodiment. So the humility of God and embodiment are actually, they're like a double helix. You can't separate them. That's why it's incarnational, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah. Before I hit record, Sister Ilia, you were telling me about how you were using Franciscan Prayer, and got it right here. You said you were recently using this book for something else that you were working on, and I was just curious how the themes you wrote about 20 years ago in this book still apply to your work today, and how they continue to evolve within you.
yeah. So again, coming out of the example of in the life of Francis of Assisi, I think one of the lines that has always stayed with me is something that Thomas of Celano wrote in his first life, where he said, Francis did not so much pray as he himself became living prayer. And I think that's a really, really important line for us, because today we live in this world of methods, like what method should I use to get close to God, and it's like, well, I'll try centering prayer, I'm going to do meditation, I'm going to do yoga. So we're always kind of focused on the steps of the method, and making sure we get the method right, and did I achieve what the aims of the method. And it's like, Francis did none of that. And it really goes back to, again, a very simple, I think Francis, being a very simple person, took that kind of maxim from Jesus, where your heart is, there your treasure lies. Where your mind is, there your treasure lies. And I think he made his every effort to focus his mind, on the love of God. And that's as simple as it gets. It's about mind focusing. And that is what meditation and centering prayer are about. It's just that he disciplined himself. So it's not just centering your mind. Prayer requires a reordering of our lives. If to be a living prayer is not something you can kind of, do, it's what you are. So you have to reorder what you are, kind of restructure your priorities. How do you govern what goes into your head and what comes out of your head, like what we're thinking about, the choices we make. So I think prayer, again, is so fundamental. So the prayer and the humility of God actually go hand in hand. I wrote them as two books, but they really could have been written as one book, because Bonaventure himself, in The Soul's Journey to God, really begins on that level of creation, but it's about a prayerful journey into God that ends on the level of the crucified Christ. So many people ask me, so what do you do? Like, how do you pray? Especially because I write about evolution and technology and stuff. I don't do that much, quite honestly. You don't have to do, you have to be. So it's not about doing, it's about being. And that's hard for us to get our head around. Like, what does that mean? Being. And just becoming aware of your own, your own existence in relation to what draws that existence to more life, which is God. So,
Yeah, what would you say that being was for someone like Saint Francis or Saint Bonaventure or Saint Clare for that matter, or even a Scotus? Like what was being? What does that mean to be, particularly as it pertains to prayer?
yeah, I don't, I think sometimes we overly romanticize Francis and Clare, quite honestly, as if, they just kind of woke up and had this ecstatic, vision of God or something. But I think you had to really work hard at it. I mean, when you read Francis, you get the sense that this little Italian guy got really annoyed with people. He really didn't like lepers. He had his likes and dislikes, and he really had to train himself. So what I see in Francis and Clare is a strong will. They were very strong willed, and they really set their minds on loving God, on this gospel way of life, following the footprints of Christ. And that's what they were going to do no matter what, and their minds weren't distracted by Facebook and social media and television and everything else. They had and whatever distractions came into their life, they made sure they got them out of their lives. So I think Francis, again, we see in the biographies, he struggled with his body, his sexual desires, probably his love for Claire. Was that just a platonic love? And I'm sure she had the same thing. I mean, they were real people, and they had, real desires, and that's the good. And so prayer is what helped them kind of come back. Well, what am I about? Like, what do I really, really want? And it's about desire. So prayer is fundamentally about desire. And that's what I see both in Francis and in Clare. Clare's letters to Agnes of Prague, really are about, what do you desire, Agnes? Set your gaze, set your heart on this love of God, shown to us in this cross. And that's what I find today is Franciscan prayer can help resituate, how would I say, reorganize ourselves, kind of retune our GPS signals, because our desires are all over the place. It's like, I want to be famous. I want people to love me. I want $1 million. I want, and I just want everything. And they're like, well, maybe just try one thing, God. And then everything else from there will find its own, order. And that's what Franciscan prayer is about. It's about ordering the desires based on what is our deepest desire. Yeah.
Yeah, I had that question written down actually, like how do desire and prayer go together?
Huge.
Yeah.
I think desire actually needs much more attention than what our minds are doing. I'd like to shift our modern attention away from what we know to what we desire. And I think because desire, from there flows everything else. And I think our postmodern world is, because everything now is accessible and readily visible, we want it all. And that's why we have a dissolution, in fact, dispersion of desires. And we can't find ourselves. We're kind of lost. We're all over the place. We can't really figure out who God is. So we have all these culture wars and, political wars, and we want to be gods and all this kind of stuff. It's a mess, really. If desire gets flattened out or dispersed all over the place, the rest of us is going to be really a mess. And I think we can learn from Francis and Clare what it means to reset the button of desire. Like one of the lines from Francis that always spoke to me is when he opens the gospel. It's shortly after he experiences this God in his life and has this conversion experience. He goes into the church and he opens the gospel and he reads, if you wish to be perfect, go sell what you own, etc. He said, this is what I want with my whole heart. This is what I want with my whole heart. And that's our question. Can we say, this is what I want with my whole heart? Like everything about me will be devoted and focused to this. And the question is, what is this? That's our question. What is the this of our lives? Is it God? Is it my family? Is it God family? Is it God family job? Is it God family job and the Yankees winning? Is it God family job and the Knicks winning? What is it? What's the this of our lives? And once we get to that, the this and that, we'll be able to know that which is most important for us. So it's not that these are exclusions, it's that they're ordered. The thisness of our lives orders everything else.
Yeah. How do you like, what does it look like today to quote reset the button of desire? And as you said, get back to thisness, and then also answer the question of what this actually is. Because I can, sometimes I think that this is something, but it's all ego, and that desire is coming from maybe not a bad place, but it's coming from a place that it's not the deepest desire. It's not this. So what would you have to say about that?
Yeah, no, I think a few things. One is that we definitely need to slow down. This is no great insight here. Everyone's talking about it today. We're on the treadmill, in the left lane on the speedway, going to the same red light that, the person driving 20 miles an hour is going to. We need to slow down and we need to unplug. We are bombarded. We just live in this information milieu. So we're constantly being bombarded by information. And I think we're losing the sense of self, the self of the self, or the God self, or that deepest sense of who we are, where that button of desire really is, that place of the heart. So that would be number one, slowing down, unplugging, and just being attentive to that place of the heart within. The second is, what are we willing to sacrifice for that which we desire? So we don't do well on sacrifice, because we live in the age of greed and need. It's like, if I want it, I'm going to have it, and we want it all. And of course, we never have it all. So we're always living the anxiety of never having enough. But if I say, for example, I want to love in a way that makes God visible and real in our lives, say that's my desire, or maybe that's too lofty. So you say, well, I want to really help another person, without any recompense. I don't want any reward. I really just want to help another person be human. And well, what are we willing to sacrifice? On a very common level, that could be anything from like the poor person on the corner asking for money to, the person trying to cross the street in a wheelchair. And those are simple ways we can help people. But like, how much are we willing to go the extra mile, say, for forgiveness? Many people in our age, lots of disputes and oppositions. People are telling me now, because of the politics in our country, we have pro-Trump, anti-Trump, and families can't get together anymore because they can't talk civilly. And they're Catholic. I'm like, wow, okay, that's a problem. So what do we really want? Do we have to be right all the time? Do we have to actually justify our opinions, our judgments? Can we let them go? Can we really meet one another on a different level? So sacrifice can take on a whole different, all sorts of forms. And I think, one of the highest things is that we are certainly not willing to sacrifice our comforts and our securities for the sake of the larger earth, for the sake of the poor, to be inclusive, to be, in a sense, in solidarity with all creatures. So setting our desires is a huge step for us. Going from that which I experience most within me, what I really want, to what I'm willing to sacrifice, to in a sense perfect that desire. And then in the end, what am I willing to spend of my own life? Like, am I willing to give my own life for the sake of another? Or what Francis would say, his desire for martyrdom. And that just seems like that's really wacky for our American culture, right? That's like, okay, that's enough. And yet, we're all going to die, right? I mean, that's just a fact of life. That's just part of life. The question is not that we're going to die, is that what are we willing to die for? And I think that's all part of our desire, question of desire.
Yeah. And is this one of the connections between the two books as well, where you
Yes.
talk about sacrifice? And I was talking to someone about this the other day, that like I think it's one of the reasons I love to coach, is that it's hard, it's tough, but you're just giving and you're just loving young people, and you're trying to help them, and you're using sport is an avenue to help them develop mental and emotional strategies. And there's this sacrifice, this giving, that when it comes to the Franciscan vision of who God is, like the Bonaventure, vision of like this fountain fullness, this kenosis, this self-giving, self-diffusiveness, something that is like flowing perpetually from the core of reality itself. It's like, in a very real way, it's almost as if I'm aligning myself with the trajectory of the universe. Like, am I reading, like, is that an okay bridge between the two books, or what would you add to that?
Yeah, no, I think so. The self-diffusive God is what prayer should lead us into, for one thing. I mean, becoming that living prayer is then not just simply praying, but in a sense, allowing that to self-diffusive goodness of God to, in a sense, be diffused in my own life,
Mm.
right? And so, in a sense, we become what we love, basically. And therefore the humility of God becomes the root reality of my life, as I begin to live that reality, which is the living prayer. And so it's a constant deepening in that reality, that I'm no longer praying, I'm actually indwelling. I'm indwelling the humility of God, who then, in a sense, the problem today is not God, it's us. you know, the self-diffusive goodness of God, the love of God, is what keeps this creation, I think, in a unified way, moving towards something more. But it's we who hold back, right? To use Francis's language, hold back nothing of yourselves for yourselves, but give yourself totally to him who has given himself totally to you. And that sounds very poetic and very spiritual, but that's our challenge. We do hold back. And like you say, even coaching a team, it's hard because it means going out of yourself, right? Sometimes to bring those players in who are really not getting it, or they're not understanding the plays, or they're just messing up because they're too preoccupied on their phones or something, and calling them into a team, calling them into a unity because there's something to achieve together. And that's why the humility of God in terms of our own lives is not just about us. That love itself is unitive. It's being called into a bigger reality, into a teamwork. Like the universe is really seeking to form the best team possible for the greatest celebration of play. And we remain very individual. Like, I really don't want to get involved in that game too much, or this is going to cost me. Like, I don't want to spend that much time practicing, and in that type thing. And same thing, practice for winning is practice for living. It's the same idea. And it's about prayer, or deepening that presence of God within us. And then it's about living in that humility of God, or the self-diffusive love that's already within us. We have it within us. It's not that we have to go finding it. It's here. The problem is us. We keep closed doors and shut windows to that humble love of God within us. But
Yeah. And I've noticed that in my own life, where it's there's something very uncomfortable about confronting the reality that God humbly enters in time and time again, because that means that if I'm to live into the fullness of my own being, I have to enter in as well, even places that perhaps I don't want to go.
That's
People
correct.
that you disagree with, people, the list of things you mentioned earlier, but it's like God enters in, God bends low.
Is there. That God is there. And I think, I think the unreconciled God or the unloved God is not a God you really want to know, right? It's
mm,
like if you're not loved, what do? You kind of act out, right? And you kind of go seeking that love by doing crazy things.
mm,
And sometimes I think, I think the disruption of our world can be the unloved God. It's like, look, you're not being attentive, to where I am already within you. And so Francis says the love of him who loved us is great to be loved. While nice and pious, it's like he kind of got it. Like if we don't love God, we do bear the consequences of an unloved divinity. And
mm.
that's really not pretty at all, and this would be my modern, interpretation here. And I'm going to, admit that I'm throwing in a little bit of Carl Jung into Franciscan spirituality.
That doesn't sound like you, Sister Ilia.
But I'm just so amazed how we are our own obstacles to the very world we desire, and that's our problem. And Francis, in his own simple way, he understood that. His admonitions clearly point in that direction. You know, we're the problem. God is not the problem. Bonaventure too. God. The whole point of a diffusive and humble God is the whole creation is, as Francis recognized at the end, it's filled with God. It's pregnant with God, to use Angela Foligno's
Mm,
phrase. So creation's not the problem. Nature is not the problem. Little animals are not the problem. We humans, we're the big problem, you
mm.
know, and we have a choice to make. We have to not just know, we have to really will to love.
Mm.
That's our challenge in the modern age.
Yeah. Yeah. Last question about Franciscan prayer. What would you say would be, you've mentioned a couple things, but what would you say if you were, this is probably too too open, but most people don't put Franciscan and prayer together. And I think you mentioned this in your introduction, where a student came up to you and she was like, Franciscan prayer? Like, what does that mean exactly? What would you say is like the Franciscan tradition's unique contribution to something as expansive as prayer? And perhaps in particular, something that we're missing today.
Yeah, I think Claire of Assisi really gave us a nice segue into that question because she was brought up in the monastic tradition. She lived under the Benedictine rule, and therefore Lectio Divina was very familiar to her, right? Where you take the scriptures and you read the passage, and then you reflect on the passage, and then you keep meditating on it until it leads you to a deeper sense of God. And I think Francis Francis had nothing like that. He opened the book. He said, "Yep, that's it. That's what I want." And then what did he do? He went out and he made an effort to focus his heart on that which he had experienced. So it's about meeting God in the concrete other, which Claire puts that in the first line: gaze upon him, gaze, see. Seeing is everything here. So it's not about reflection, it's about seeing. That's our first step to prayer. It's seeing in the seeing the tree, seeing the poor person, seeing the Republican, seeing the Democrat, right? Seeing the drop of water. And then as we see, to use Angela's words, so we love, right? Seeing. And it's about falling in love by seeing the deep, seeing more than what's mere superficial. It's Francis seeing in the hand of the leper more than just the ugliness of disfigurement. There was a goodness there. And we're blind. I mean, Bonaventure writes this about often, and so does Francis. We're blind. And that's right out of the Gospels, right? It's because you say you see, Jesus said, that your blindness remains, as he said to the Pharisees. It's really, the Franciscan prayer is about seeing and loving, being attentive, being seeing by being attentive to what one sees, um, being intelligent, in other words, to use Lonergan's language, being reasonable about this, and then responding, in love. If we don't see, we're not going to love, right?
Yeah.
It's just an object that's in our way. Like it's just an object, even persons are objects in our way, like because we're blind, we don't see. And so of what value is prayer? So, you meet people and they're in church and praying and praying, 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 and their heads are, in some lofty realm of some spiritual something or other. And then they go out and they're like stepping over, like, the person lying in the street. They don't see. I'm not saying that all contemplatives are like that, but we have a tendency to spiritualize things apart from the concrete, the embodiment of things. We miss out the bodies and we become blind. So Franciscan prayer is really about seeing the humility of God.
Yeah. In seeing, like when you say that, it's you're seeing the goodness of the person, correct? And in that goodness, there is the humility of God in
Yeah,
action.
people don't know, what does that mean? What should I, like, people have said to me, what should I look for?
It's a good question.
What should I look for if I need to see good? And that's really a kind of funny thing, because what does it mean to see the good? And Bonaventure helps us. It's like to see the beauty of something, to see it's kind of radiant wisdom. It's like, wow, like you look at a tree and you go, and you look at a tree and then you really look at it and you go, it's wow, it's incredible. It's wonder, it's awesomeness. Even the way, if you look at a person, look at their facial features. They have distinct features. They have, like me, I have a broken nose. So, and then you go, wow, there's something about the way you're constituted that's a beauty. It's all its own. It's a unique beauty, right? That no other person could replace, or you can't clone it. And so it's beauty, it's goodness, it's the wisdom. And when we see that beauty, I think really goodness is about beauty, quite honestly.
Yeah.
Beauty that cannot be, it can't be reproduced by a pixel, or by a computer. It's a beauty that is so unclonable, it's so unique, it's so distinct because it's radiating in this particular way and in no other way, and that's it. It's not just the beauty, it's this beauty, to use the Scotistic term of Che, the thisness of something. And I think that's what Francis saw in the leper. And that's what prayer has to lead us to. It's this beauty, this leaf, this rock, this leper, this noble person, this Lady Clare, not anyone else. And we're losing that. We're losing the thisness of our age in an information age. Now we're all algorithms, we can replace these algorithms and build on them. And that, when you lose the thisness, then it gets lost in the algorithms of information. We then lose the desire for beauty.
Yeah. Well, speaking of beauty, I mean, this conversation has been beautiful. I mean, it's I've really, anytime I get the chance to talk to you, I mean, it stirs something within me. And yeah, I know I'm just so grateful for you and your work. And I know Franciscan Media, everyone there is really excited about the refresh of these two books. This has been great, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Do you have anything else that you'd like to discuss?
No, Stephen, thank you. Thank you for your great work, and may Franciscan Media keep spreading the message of this great tradition.
Thanks so much. Again, that was Sister Ilia Delio. Franciscan Prayer and Humility of God are both available in the Franciscan Media store at shop.franciscanmedia.org. If you enjoyed this conversation, I think you'll really enjoy both of these books. Huge thanks to Sister Ilia for being on the Off the Page podcast from Franciscan Media, and thanks as well to Father Cyprian Concilio for providing the music for this episode. I encourage you to check his music out on Spotify or wherever you listen to your music. This is Stephen Copeland signing off. Peace and all good.
I will lead you into the desert with me and tenderly speak to your